My name is Lena Crawford. I'm 28 years old, a freelance photojournalist living in a cramped studio apartment just outside Portland. For most of my life, I've been the family disappointment, the one who walked away from the Whitmore fortune to chase truth through a camera lens. But that all changed the day of my grandfather's will reading. Surrounded by relatives in tailored suits and fake condolences, I was handed a check for exactly $25. They laughed. They whispered. They thought they'd won. Then the lawyer handed me a sealed letter, and everything I thought I knew shattered. If you've ever been underestimated or cast aside by your own blood, this story might hit home. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more true stories where karma doesn't whisper. It roars. The rain hadn't let up all morning. It tapped relentlessly against the tinted windows of the Whitmore and Sons law office, as if even the sky knew what kind of storm was brewing inside. I sat in the corner of the grand conference room, soaked from the short walk from the parking garage, my thrifted black coat clinging to my skin. The room was cold in every sense, polished marble floors, leather chairs, and relatives who barely looked at me. My name is Lena Crawford. I'm 28, a freelance photojournalist. And for the last 10 years, I've lived miles and worlds away from the wealth and whispers of the Whitmore legacy. While my cousins wore tailored suits and inherited job titles, I traveled from war zones to back alley protests, capturing truths too ugly for headlines. To them I was a dropout, a disgrace. And now, apparently, the entertainment. Are we really waiting for Lena? Jillian, my cousin with a permanent sneer, muttered as she adjusted her designer scarf. Grandfather Charles was generous, not delusional. I pretended not to hear. Mr. Ellison, the family's attorney for over 4 decades, cleared his throat from the head of the table. His presence always carried a weight, and today, the silence he commanded was suffocating. We're here to honor the last will and testament of Charles Edward Whitmore, he began, his voice even and grave. Please, let's maintain respect. Respect. A word my family only wore in public. The reading began. One by one the names were called. Property in Nantucket to Jillian. The yacht to my Uncle Greg. Stock portfolios, art collections, luxury cars. Every announcement met with forced humility and sideways glances. I watched as they accepted their treasures like they were owed, like it was only right that legacy should reward them for playing by the rules. I kept waiting for my name. And then it came. To my granddaughter Lena Crawford, Mr. Ellison said, pausing just long enough to gather a few raised eyebrows. I leave the amount of $25. Silence. Then laughter. Jillian actually clapped. $25. My cousin Nathan repeated with a smirk. What's she supposed to do with that? Buy a coffee and cry into it? I felt the blood drain from my face. Not because of the money but the message. This was public exile. A final stamp of rejection from the only man in the family who ever told me I saw the world differently. I swallowed hard. My throat burned. I couldn't move. Couldn't speak. I just stared at the check that had been discreetly handed to me. My name typed neatly. The amount insultingly clear. $25. They kept laughing, whispering behind manicured hands, glancing at me with a kind of pity that cuts deeper than cruelty. I should have left. I wanted to. But something made me stay. Maybe pride. Maybe anger. Maybe the faint, desperate hope that this wasn't all there was. And then, as the room began to settle into smug satisfaction, Mr. Ellison looked at me. Lena, he said gently, his eyes shifting. There is something else. He reached beneath the stack of folders and produced a small envelope. It was cream-colored, thick, with my name handwritten in ink I recognized instantly. It wasn't the formal script used for the legal documents. This was personal. The way he used to sign my birthday cards. Charles Whitmore. My grandfather. Mr. Ellison extended the envelope to me with both hands, a flicker of something unreadable in his expression. The room went quiet again. But this time it wasn't amusement. It was confusion, and maybe a little fear. I took the envelope. It was sealed in wax. My fingers trembled. Suddenly, $25 didn't feel like the end of the story. Felt like the beginning. The envelope felt heavier than it looked. As I held it in my palm, the laughter in the room faded into a distant hum, like a radio on low volume behind a closed door. I couldn't stop staring at the wax seal. It was burgundy, firm, unbroken, stamped with the unmistakable crest of the Whitmore family. A bold W encased in ivy leaves. The same seal my grandfather used on every personal letter he'd ever written, from my childhood birthday cards to his formal holiday letters. But this wasn't a card. This was something else. I glanced up at Mr. Ellison. He gave me a small, tight nod, the kind that said, "Read it, but not here." The air in the room had shifted. Even Jillian wasn't speaking now. They were all watching, silent and curious. The moment their laughter turned to suspicion was the exact moment they realized they might not know everything after all. I slipped the envelope into my coat pocket. "That concludes the formal reading of Charles Whitmore's last will and testament," Mr. Ellison announced, snapping his leather folder shut. "Please see my assistant outside for copies of your documentation." As he stood, the chairs scraped backward. The room filled again with polite chatter, but the tone was different. Less gloating, more nervous calculation. I didn't move. My heart was racing, pounding so hard I felt it in my teeth. Uncle Greg passed behind me and paused just long enough to mutter, "If that letter's a check for more than $25, better read the fine print." I didn't respond. He walked off. My hands clenched inside my coat pockets, knuckles whitening around the envelope. I was suddenly aware of how small I looked in that giant leather chair at the end of the table. But I wouldn't leave yet. Not while they were watching. Not until their eyes stopped trying to weigh my worth. As the others trickled out, Mr. Ellison came over and leaned slightly toward me. "Miss Crawford," he said quietly, "if you have a moment, there's a private office down the hall. You can read the letter in peace." I looked at him carefully. "Why now?" I asked. He hesitated, then said, "Because your grandfather wanted you to hear their laughter first." A chill ran down my spine. I nodded, stood, and followed him out. The hallway outside the conference room was lined with framed certificates and oil portraits of retired partners. The law firm looked as old as the family name it protected. Rich wood, soft carpet, expensive silence. He led me to a corner office and opened the door. "Take your time," he said. "I'll be just down the hall." I stepped inside and shut the door behind me. The room smelled faintly of old books and leather. A large oak desk dominated the center. No windows. No distractions. Just me, a chair, and the envelope burning a hole through my coat. I sat down, pulled it out, and placed it on the desk. The wax seal stared at me like a closed eye. My fingers hovered over it. Then I broke it. The sound was soft, almost inaudible, but it echoed inside me like thunder. I pulled out several pages of thick stationery. Cream-colored, the corners rounded from age or care. The handwriting was undeniably his, steady, elegant, and curved in a way no one wrote anymore. "My dearest Lena, if you're reading this, it means the will has been read, and you've likely been handed the most insulting inheritance of any Whitmore descendant in history. $25. Token. Decoy. An old man's trick. Before you curse my name, and I know you well enough to know you probably already did, please read this entire letter. Every word has been chosen with purpose. Just as every silence in that conference room was designed to reveal the people sitting in it. You've spent most of your life on the outside of this family. Not by accident, not entirely by choice, but because you refused to wear the mask. And I loved you for that." I leaned back in the chair, breath stuck in my throat. "You may not know this," the letter continued, "but long before I was the man who wore suits and shook hands over skyscrapers, I was a boy who wanted to be a photographer. I had a darkroom in the garage and a beat-up Canon I bought with lawn mowing money. I used to sneak out at night to take pictures of streetlights and strangers. Told no one. My father, your great-grandfather, made it clear that creativity was a disease in our bloodline. Gave it up. Or at least I buried it. But you, Lena, you didn't. You followed it." I could barely keep my hand steady as I turned the page. A faint blur of ink where tears had touched the paper told me he'd written this with emotion. It wasn't just words. It was confession. You're wondering about the $25. Me explain. When I told my father I wanted to leave law school and start a creative agency, he gave me $25. He said, "This is all you'll ever get from me." I took it and walked out of that house. And I built an empire. Not because I wanted to be rich, but because I had to prove that worth can't be measured in inheritance. I stopped reading. I stared at the letter, at the clean lines of ink, at the edges that curled slightly from being held for too long. My grandfather, the same man who built half of Boston's skyline, who drank scotch with senators, who called art a hobby, was once a dreamer. Like me. No, not like me. Exactly like me. Now it's your turn, the next page began. Your real inheritance is not in the will the others heard. It's in the documents Mr. Ellison is holding in a separate file. He'll explain everything. But I'll give you this much. You are now the majority shareholder of Whitmore Industries. You own 61% of the corporation. You also now possess all my private real estate, including the house on Stonehill Lane, my private gallery, and an unlisted property in Vermont. Your new studio if you choose. My mouth fell open. My entire body went still. 61%. Not a piece. Not a donation. Control. You'll need guidance, which Ellison will provide. And you'll need strength, because what comes next will test every boundary you've built. They will turn on you, Lena. The same people who laugh today will whisper poison tomorrow. Be ready. And never forget, you are not here because you followed the rules. You're here because you broke them. That's what I needed you to do. I'll see you on the other side. With love always, Charles. The final signature was unmistakable. Not scribbled. Not rushed. Deliberate. I folded the letter slowly, reverently, as if closing a chapter of something sacred. Then I just sat there. For minutes. Maybe more. I didn't cry. Not yet. The tears would come later, in waves, when no one could see. But right then what filled me was silence. Not the silence of shame or grief. A different kind. The kind that precedes an awakening. A knock came gently at the door. I stood, wiped my eyes with the sleeve of my coat, and opened it. Mr. Ellison stood in the hallway, holding a leather-bound folder. "Shall we talk?" he said. I nodded. I didn't know what my life would look like in a week. But for the first time in years, I knew who I was. And it terrified me. And thrilled me. I followed Mr. Ellison down a narrower hallway. The kind you don't find unless you've been there too many years or know exactly what to look for. The walls were closer here. The air felt older. Not dusty but sacred. Like memories lived here, waiting behind doors that never fully opened. He didn't speak. Neither did I. We stopped at a dark mahogany door with a brass plate etched simply with the word private. He opened it with a key that looked older than him. I stepped inside. The room wasn't large, but it felt vast. Floor-to-ceiling shelves wrapped the walls, filled with thick folders, sealed envelopes, ledgers, and safe boxes. Not a single photo or framed diploma. Just papers and power. In the center of the room was a simple desk. And on that desk sat a leather-bound folder. It was smaller than I expected. Almost modest. But as Mr. Ellison walked toward it and rested his hand gently on its cover, I knew this was it. My life, my real life, was inside that folder. "Your grandfather left very specific instructions," he said, voice low and deliberate. "This file was not to be opened until after the reading. And only in your presence." I stepped forward slowly. My heart thudded louder than my footsteps. He opened the folder. Inside were several documents. Typed, notarized, some with blue ribbons attached to the corners. But it was the title page that froze me. Transfer of ownership. Whitmore Industries. Primary beneficiary. Lena Crawford. I sat down. My knees wouldn't have held me upright any longer anyway. "There is no mistake," he said. "Your grandfather restructured the company's bylaws 10 months ago. This transfer gives you controlling interest. You now own 61% of Whitmore Industries, including all subsidiary holdings, intellectual property, and private equity. He paused to let the weight land. And it did. Hard. My fingers hovered over the edge of the document. The paper was thick, expensive, and entirely real. But my brain kept insisting it had to be a dream. Because in the span of a single morning, I had gone from being the family ghost to holding the entire empire in my hands. Why? I asked, my voice cracking. Because he trusted you, Ellison replied simply. But I don't even know how to run a company. He nodded. He didn't expect you to. That's why he made arrangements. The executive team will remain in place. Your role, at least for now, is oversight and vision. He believed you had both. And frankly, so do I. I stared at him. Vision. Me. I was a woman who spent the last 4 years stitching rent together with freelance contracts and odd jobs. I photographed abandoned buildings, protests, old rail stations. I hadn't touched a stock report in my life. And yet, I wasn't panicking. Because somewhere deep beneath the storm of disbelief, something steadier was rising. Not ego. Not ambition. But clarity. Charles Whitmore hadn't chosen me because I was clever with money. He'd chosen me because I'd never let money be my identity. There's more, Ellison said, lifting another sheet. He also transferred full ownership of several private properties. The one on Stonehill Lane in Vermont. And the gallery space in Beacon Hill. Blinked. Gallery. He gave me a look that carried weight. He didn't just admire your work, Lena. He collected it. I don't understand. Ellison opened another envelope, pulling out several glossy prints, photos. My photos. You sold over 70 pieces in the last 6 years to anonymous buyers, he said. Some under the name Patrick Sullivan. Others through art consortiums he controlled. My chest tightened. Patrick Sullivan. I had seen that name so many times on receipts and sales ledgers. I thought it was just another collector with deep pockets and mysterious taste. It was him. All along it had been him. He curated them, Ellison continued. Hung them in a private gallery in Beacon Hill. His personal space. No one else in the family knows about it. My hands trembled as I reached for the photos. There they were, shots from my earliest gallery shows. Grainy black and whites from the protest in Baltimore. The long exposure of a woman staring into a rainy cafe window. The photo I took of an abandoned piano in a flood-damaged school. Each one framed, preserved, treasured. Tears welled in my eyes. He hadn't just watched from afar. He had seen me. He had believed in me. When can I see it? I asked. Ellison smiled faintly. Now, if you're ready. We left the law office 20 minutes later. The drive across Boston was a blur of red lights and falling rain. My thoughts so loud they drowned out the world. I stared out the window but saw nothing except flashes of memory. My grandfather's voice telling me to follow the light. His crinkled smile the last time we spoke. The soft, fatherly way he'd ruffled my hair even when I was well into my 20s. He knew he was dying. And he spent his final months building a secret world for me to find. We turned onto a cobbled street lined with gaslit lanterns and ivy-covered facades. The buildings here were older than memory. Old Boston money wrapped in silence and history. The car stopped in front of a narrow brownstone with no plaque. No signage. Just a black iron gate and a red door. Ellison handed me a key. He left the building in your name, he said. It's yours now. The entire space. I stepped out into the mist and unlocked the door. The hinges groaned faintly as it opened, and I stepped into a narrow foyer. The smell hit me first. Linseed oil, fresh wood, old paper, and something else I couldn't name. Something warm. I took a few steps forward and stopped. The hallway opened into a vaulted gallery, and I gasped. My photographs lined the walls in perfect symmetry. Every piece I had ever sold. Framed. Lit. Honored. It wasn't just a gallery. It was a timeline. My timeline. My journey. My voice. The early work was on the left. Grainy, urgent, raw. Protests. Homeless shelters. Refugees. Then came the travel pieces. Cobblestone alleys in Spain, desert sunsets in Morocco, the fractured skyline of Gaza City. And finally the most recent portraits. Intimate. Aching. Human. I moved slowly through the space, overwhelmed by the realization that someone had preserved my life as art. Not for display. Not for commerce. But because they believed it mattered. I reached the end of the gallery. There in the center sat a desk. On it, a leather-bound journal. And a note. Lena, this is your studio now. Your sanctuary. Your stage. Make something beautiful. I sank into the chair behind the desk, the journal still in my hands. For the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel like the outcast. I felt like I belonged. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I wasn't tired, but because something inside me had been awakened, and it refused to settle. I stayed in the gallery until the city dimmed into silence. I sat at the desk where my grandfather had once stood, surrounded by the echoes of my own work. I traced the edges of frames, read the labels carefully printed in his hand, and ran my fingers over the journal he'd left for me. The pages inside were filled with notes, not just about my photographs but about me. November 12th. Her photo of the man on the bench. Loneliness without pity. She sees the world without filters. But January 7th. Bought 3 more pieces under Sullivan's name. She doesn't know. She must not. Not yet. March 3rd. Gallery design complete. A reflection of her. Not me. This place must belong to her voice, not mine. Each line was a window. Schwerd a key. I didn't cry. Thought I would. But there was something about his presence in that space. His quiet reverence for what I had created, that made me feel held. Like grief had softened into gratitude. By morning, Boston's skyline had turned to gold under the early sun, and I still hadn't left. Instead, I stood in the main room of the gallery with my arms crossed, staring at the largest photograph in the space. A black and white portrait of a young woman sitting alone at a diner, chin resting on her fist, 1,000 miles in her eyes. I had taken it in Chicago. Never knew the woman's name. But Grandpa had bought it instantly. She looks like you used to, he had once said. Always watching. Always wondering if you're allowed to speak. He'd seen everything. And now he had passed that sight to me. At noon, I returned to my apartment in South Boston, packed 2 bags, and left without saying a word to my landlord. I moved into the Beacon Hill Gallery that afternoon. The entire upper floor had been designed as a loft. Open kitchen, exposed beams, bookshelves full of art history and photo theory. There was even a small rooftop garden with wild rosemary and mint. He had prepared it for me. Quietly. Lovingly. Without obligation. And yet the silence didn't last. Never does. 3 days later the family called. The first was Jillian. I watched her name flash across my phone screen while I was scanning some negatives in the darkroom. I let it ring. The second was Uncle Greg. Then Aunt Nadine. Then even Cousin Nathan, who once told me I'd wasted my genes on a useless career. They all left messages. The tone varied. Curious, anxious, then increasingly desperate. But the one that finally made me answer was from Heather. My cousin Heather had always been the least vicious. She stayed in the background. Watched the fights but never joined them. She worked in legal affairs for Whitmore Industries. And we hadn't spoken in over 2 years. Her voicemail was different. Lena. Hey, I don't know if you're getting these, but something's happened. And it's everywhere now. Your name's in the filings. You're the majority shareholder. I don't understand. No one does. Look, please call me. Or meet me. I just want to talk. I swear. Played it twice. Then again. So it was out. Someone had found the SEC documents. Maybe a shareholder. Maybe an employee. But word had spread. I was now the controlling owner of Whitmore Industries. And the wolves were circling. That night, I agreed to meet Heather at a coffee shop near Harvard Square. Neutral ground. Busy enough to stay public. Quiet enough to hear the unspoken. She arrived before me. She wore a navy pantsuit, her blonde hair pinned back. She stood when I entered, eyes searching mine for something she couldn't name. "You look," she said, then stopped. "Like myself," I offered. She smiled awkwardly. I wasn't going to say different. We Saturday ordered. Waited in that tense silence that fills the space between estranged relatives. Then she leaned in. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" And blinked. "You think I knew?" Her face fell. "You didn't." "Not until the day of the reading," I said. "I got the $25 check like everyone else heard. Then Mr. Ellison gave me a letter." She shook her head. "And that letter changed everything." I pulled it from my coat pocket. I had carried it every day since. Folded carefully. Worn at the edges. I slid it across the table. She read in silence. Halfway through, her fingers trembled. When she finished, she set it down gently. "I didn't know he felt this way," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "About you. About all of it." I leaned forward. "Neither did I." We sat like that for a long time, the coffee untouched between us. Finally she said, "They're already planning a response. Uncle Greg and Aunt Nadine are talking about challenging the will. Jillian's calling shareholders. Trying to build a coalition." I nodded. I expected as much. "They'll lose," I said. "Probably," she agreed. "But that doesn't mean they won't try to destroy you in the process." Her eyes were steady. Not cruel. Not kind. Just honest. "Then let them try." That night, back at the gallery, I sat with the journal again. I read a new page. They will hate her for this. But maybe not all of them. Maybe one will remember what it means to lead with heart. I thought of Heather. Maybe. 2 days later I received an invitation. Family dinner. At Aunt Nadine's mansion in Brookline. To discuss the estate, it said. Polite. Elegant. Trap. Smiled. Because I knew I'd go. Not to beg. Not to explain. But to see their faces when I arrived with nothing to prove. I had spent my whole life waiting to be seen. But now I saw them. Clearly. And I wasn't the outsider anymore. I was the one holding the mirror. The driveway was lined with black SUVs and polished luxury sedans, the kind of cars that announced their owners before they stepped out. Floodlights cast a soft glow on the stone facade of Aunt Nadine's estate, and I could already hear the muted laughter behind the frosted windows. It wasn't joy. It was strategy. The kind of laughter that masks knives in the throat. I stood across the street in a plain wool coat, the same one I wore the day of the will reading. The same one I had worn while my family smirked and snickered over my $25 inheritance. Fitting. Let them believe I still had nothing. Inside my bag was the original letter from Charles Whitmore. I hadn't planned to show it. Not yet. But tonight would be about posture, not proof. I crossed the street. A valet opened the door for me with a polite nod. I stepped inside and let the warmth of the foyer sink into my coat. Aunt Nadine appeared almost instantly. "Lena," she said, her arms spreading as if we were close. "You made it." Her voice was sweetened with effort. Her perfume was too strong. And her smile. Well, that hadn't changed since the first time she told my mother I was too creative to be stable. I nodded. "Thank you for the invitation." She waved it off. Family must stick together. Especially during times like these. As if they hadn't spent decades pretending I didn't exist. She led me into the main parlor. Crystal chandeliers hung like glass knives overhead. The fireplace crackled beneath a gilt-framed oil painting of a Whitmore estate in Vermont. Every cushion, every rug, every silver tray. Meant to convey class, control, and legacy. Around the room my family turned. Uncle Greg near the bar, drink in hand. Jillian sitting like royalty on a leather chaise. Her lips already curled with skepticism. Nathan. Twins. Cousin Elizabeth. Faces that once watched me fall from grace now blinked with growing confusion at my calm. We were just talking about you, Jillian said with a glassy grin. That's never a good sign, I said, removing my coat slowly. They chuckled, but only a little, because now that I stood in their space, upright, unbothered, they didn't quite know where to place me. How are you settling in? Uncle Greg asked, circling around like a banker smelling blood. I imagine it's a lot to adjust to. I tilted my head. Not really. But thank you for your concern. He raised an eyebrow. And the company. I assume you're still getting up to speed. Oh, I've always been up to speed, I said softly. I just never had a seat at the table. Was sharp and instant. Aunt Nadine broke the tension. Well, let's eat, shall we? Dinner was served in the formal dining room, a space built for power, not warmth. 16 chairs. A long mahogany table that looked more like a boardroom than a place to share stories. The plates were china. The wine was older than I was. I was seated across from Jillian, which meant she could stare directly at me for the next hour, and I could ignore her at my leisure. The meal began in forced small talk. Elizabeth asked about my photography. Nathan pretended to care about my last exhibition. Uncle Greg kept referencing financial metrics, clearly waiting for me to fumble a reply. But I didn't, because I wasn't here to defend my place. I was here to watch. And what I saw was fear, thinly veiled beneath pearls and perfectly cooked lamb. Finally it came. So, Aunt Nadine began, dabbing the corner of her lips with a linen napkin. We thought it would be good to have a conversation about the estate. Things have moved quickly. And there are a lot of moving pieces. I nodded. There are. We think, Uncle Greg chimed in, that some kind of transitional structure would benefit everyone. Something collaborative. I sipped my wine. A committee, perhaps, Jillian added, to oversee decisions while you get your footing. I looked around the table. All of them were watching me now. Not one fork lifted. I placed my glass down gently. You mean you want me to share the control Grandpa left me? No one spoke. Then Aunt Nadine, with a voice dipped in honey, said, We're offering guidance, dear. Not taking anything. I leaned forward just slightly. You took everything for years. That silenced them. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The truth had a way of amplifying itself. When I needed help, you vanished. When I sold my camera to make rent, you laughed. When I applied for internships at Whitmore Industries, you said I wasn't the right fit. And now that I have the controlling interest, you want to guide me. Lena, Greg started. You want influence, I interrupted. But you don't want to earn it. You just want to hold the reins from behind the curtain. But the curtain's gone. He stood. Every eye followed. You had your chance, I said, reaching into my coat pocket. I pulled out the folded letter and laid it gently on the table. He chose me. Jillian's voice was brittle. Out of pity. I met her gaze. Out of clarity. I turned to go but paused at the door. You don't need to like it. But you will learn to live with it. Back at the gallery that night, I sat alone on the rooftop garden with the city glittering below me. I hadn't won anything. Not yet. But I had finally said everything they had spent years trying to silence. And in the silence that followed, I heard something deeper. Not victory. Peace. The next morning the headlines hit. Whitmore Air revealed. Lena Crawford confirmed as new majority shareholder. My name was no longer a whisper. It was news. And now the world was watching. The headlines spread faster than wildfire. My phone buzzed non-stop from the moment the sun rose. My inbox doubled, then tripled in a matter of hours. Photographers began camping outside the Beacon Hill Gallery. News trucks parked across the street. Strangers snapped photos of me from behind coffee cups and corner lampposts. People who had never said my name suddenly remembered how to pronounce it perfectly. Whitmore heiress rejects board control. Black sheep turns billionaire. From photographer to power player. Who is Lena Crawford? They asked for interviews, profiles, exclusives. A few even offered to help me write my memoir. I ignored them all. This wasn't a story I was ready to share on their terms. But the world had decided otherwise. 3 days after the family dinner, I sat on the rooftop garden, my journal in my lap, when a familiar voice crackled through the intercom. "Miss Crawford," said the concierge downstairs. "There's a Mr. Peterson here to see you. Says it's urgent." My spine straightened. Mr. Peterson was Charles Whitmore's second attorney, the man who handled his personal estate, not his business affairs. The man who never showed his face unless something significant was involved. "Send him up," I said. Minutes later, he stepped into the gallery, his dark coat still wet with mist. He held a small metal case in one hand, the other clutching an envelope with my name on it. "Good morning," he said gently. "What is it?" I asked, already feeling the shift in the air. He offered me the envelope. "Your grandfather left one final directive. It was dated separately from the will, delayed by 30 days. Today is the day I was instructed to give it to you." I took it slowly, opened it. Inside was a single handwritten note. "Lena, I told you there would be more. In the basement of the gallery, beneath the second floor, you'll find a locked vault. The code is your birthday backward. Inside is a painting. The only one I ever created. The only one I never showed anyone. It's yours now." A painting. Charles Whitmore had painted. My fingers tightened around the letter. "Do you know what it is?" I asked. Mr. Peterson shook his head. "I've never seen it. But your grandfather referred to it often in his final journal. He said it was a piece of himself he never knew how to reveal." I was already moving. The basement stairs creaked under my weight. I hadn't been down here since moving in. It was cold, stone walls, unfinished floor, a faint hum of old machinery. The gallery's underbelly, the part no one ever saw. I found the vault behind a paneled wall, invisible unless you knew where to look. The keypad blinked softly, waiting. I typed in my birthday backward. 060495. 594,060. Hiss of air. Soft click. The vault opened. Inside was darkness, and a single spotlight hanging above a canvas draped in a white cloth. The air felt thick like dust and memory. I stepped inside, pulled the cloth free, and froze. It wasn't a landscape, not a building, not a still life. It was me. Portrait. Charcoal, oil, and something else I couldn't name. Real. Vulnerable. It was a younger me, maybe 20, maybe 22, sitting in a cracked leather chair, one hand gripping a camera, the other covering my mouth. Eyes full of fire. A storm held back by a thread. It was like he had painted my soul without ever asking permission. I sank to the floor. The silence around me shattered by the noise inside my chest. He saw me. Every scar. Every wall. Every threadbare dream. He had known all along. And now, after everything, after the laughter, after the letter, after the empire, he had left me not just his fortune but himself. The piece of him no one else had earned. The part that never wore suits or closed deals. The man who once chased light through a camera. Like I did. Like I still do. I brought the painting upstairs and hung it behind the gallery's main desk. No placard. No explanation. Just truth. And as the reporters lined up outside, desperate for a statement, a quote, a scandal, I let them wait. Because this wasn't their moment. It was mine. And his. Later that night, Heather came by. She stood quietly in the gallery, staring at the portrait, her arms folded tight against her chest. "I never knew he painted," she said. "Neither did I." "He loved you." I looked at her. "He believed in me," I said. "That's different. Love is easy. Belief takes work." She nodded, then pulled out an envelope. "You should see this," she said. It was a confidential memo. One that had been circulating inside Whitmore Industries since the will was made public. A group of board members had called an emergency meeting. They were planning to vote on a motion to limit my authority as majority shareholder. To restrict my power. to box me in. I folded the paper. How long do I have? 4 days, she said. They think you won't show up. Smiled. They're half right. I won't show up. I'll arrive. The battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. But this time I had something they couldn't calculate. I had vision. I had history. And I had the one thing they would never understand. The fire of someone who built herself without them. Wait for the command continue to proceed to chapter 7. You said. Continue. ChatGPT said. Chapter 7. The boardroom ambush. 4 days. That's how long they gave themselves to outmaneuver me. 4 days of whispers, backdoor calls, private dinners with shareholders, legal fine print disguised as protocol. 4 days to orchestrate a quiet coup against the girl with a camera who now held the keys to the empire. But they underestimated the quiet. They always had. I spent those 4 days not with lawyers or strategists, but alone in the gallery, walking through frames of my past. I studied the portraits, the cityscapes, the crooked smiles of strangers caught in fleeting moments of truth. I reminded myself why I had chosen to see the world through a lens in the first place. Because clarity was power. And now it was my turn to use it. The board meeting was scheduled for 9 sharp in the glass tower downtown, the same one bearing the Whitmore name in gold lettering 15 stories high. I arrived at 8:58. No assistant. No entourage. Just me. And the letter from Charles in my coat pocket. The receptionist gave me a look of mild confusion as I passed. Clearly, she wasn't used to heirs walking in alone, without briefcases or arrogance. I didn't stop at the desk. I walked straight to the elevator and took it to the 42nd floor. When the doors opened, I stepped into a hallway of glass and polished steel. The boardroom was at the end, its doors already open. Inside were 12 people seated in silence. And 11 of them were surprised to see me. The 12th, Heather, offered the faintest nod as I entered. Uncle Greg was seated near the head of the table, flanked by Jillian and 2 senior executives I didn't recognize. Lena, he said with a smile too wide to be genuine. How wonderful of you to join us. I didn't return the greeting. Instead, I walked to the other end of the table, Charles's seat, and pulled out the chair. No one stopped me. But they all watched. Every eye. Every breath. Jillian crossed her legs, her pen tapping lightly against a notepad. We were just beginning to discuss some proposed modifications to governance structure, she said, voice silky. You mean restrictions, I said plainly. Greg cleared his throat. Just safeguards. This is a complex operation. It would be prudent to allow the more experienced members of the board to provide guidance. Guidance, I repeated. Like you guided the last 3 acquisitions that lost over 60 million combined? The air crackled. I placed a folder on the table and opened it. These are audited financials, including discrepancies in consultant fees, inflated vendor contracts, and one particular offshore account tied to a name I'm sure the SEC would find interesting. Jillian's face tightened. Uncle Greg's jaw twitched. I leaned forward. If you want to talk about experience, let's talk about integrity first. No one spoke, so I kept going. My grandfather didn't choose me to run this company because I played the game. He chose me because I didn't. He knew the board would test me. And I know you will keep testing me. But I have one thing none of you expected. Pause. The truth. Heather passed a document down the table. This is a directive from the estate attorney confirming Lena's controlling interest. Any motion to restrict her authority would be in direct violation of the trust structure. She looked around the room. We would open the company to legal liability. The room shifted. The momentum broke. And then I dropped the final card. I've appointed a new ethics oversight committee. Independent. With full access to internal audits. I've also commissioned a full review of executive compensation. He stood. You're welcome to stay on board. Or you can step down. Uncle Greg's eyes blazed. This is a hostile takeover. No, I said quietly. This is the inheritance you mocked when you thought it was $25. Now you can see its real value. After the meeting, I rode the elevator down alone. My hands were shaking. Not with fear, but with release. The weight that had sat on my chest for years, of being unseen, unheard, unvalued, had shifted. Not gone, but lighter. As I stepped onto the street, cameras clicked from across the plaza. Reporters moved toward me. Microphones outstretched. Miss Crawford, any comment on the board meeting? Miss Crawford, are you planning structural changes to Whitmore Industries? Pause. Then said softly, yes, the structure is changing, and kept walking. That night, I returned to the gallery. The lights were low. The city murmured outside the windows. And the painting of me, Charles's hidden portrait, watched over the space like a guardian. I poured a glass of wine and stood in front of it, not as a girl with a camera anymore, but as the woman who held the lens. The first time I saw the woman, it was past midnight. She stood across the street from the gallery, beneath a flickering lamppost, her coat drawn tight, scarf wrapped high. She wasn't looking at her phone, wasn't walking, just watching, as if the building meant something to her, as if I did. I had just finished rearranging part of the east wall, prepping for an upcoming installation showcasing young local photographers, when I caught her silhouette through the glass. Normally, I wouldn't have paid attention, but something about her posture stirred a memory. Her stillness, her intent, frame I'd seen before. I stepped toward the window, but by the time I opened the door, she was gone. The next day brought a letter, not an email, not a message from the board. A letter, handwritten, ink bleeding faintly through the page. No name, no return address. I knew your grandfather. Not the man they all talk about. The real one. Meet me where the light bends. Saturday, 4 p.m. Bring nothing but the truth. I read it 3 times. Then a 4th. The phrase haunted me, where the light bends. It wasn't poetic. It was specific. And suddenly I remembered. A phrase Charles used in one of his earliest notes about a photograph I'd taken years ago. A photo of a glass sculpture in a forgotten museum courtyard. The caption read, "The light bends but never breaks. This is where truth hides." I'd visited that place only once. The old Courtyard Museum in Cambridge. It had long since closed. But the sculpture still stood. On Saturday I went, not because I trusted the letter, but because I needed to know if anyone else truly knew him the way I did now. The courtyard was quiet. The museum long abandoned, its windows boarded up, its marble cracked. But the sculpture remained, tall and twisting, made of glass that caught the sun in strange ways, warping reflections like water rippling across sky. She was already there. The woman from the lamppost. She turned when I approached, her face clearer now. Mid-60s. Dark eyes. Skin lined by years, not vanity. She looked like someone who had held a secret for too long. "You came," she said. I nodded. "You knew him. Better than most," she said. "But not as well as you think." I waited. She reached into her bag and pulled out a photograph. My breath caught. It was him, Charles Whitmore. But not in a suit. Not at a desk. He stood on a pier, camera slung over his shoulder, laughing. Head back. Alive. "I took this," she said softly. 40 years ago. We met at an exhibition in Paris. I was nobody. He was on the verge of becoming someone. We shared a week. And then he left. He never told me about you. He never told anyone, she said. Because he thought love made him weak. I looked at her. Were you in touch before he died? She shook her head. Not for decades. Until 6 months ago. He sent me a letter. No return address. No apology. Just closure. She handed me another envelope. This one was from him. The handwriting unmistakable. "Marie, you once told me that the most powerful art is not what we show, but what we choose to hide. I am leaving behind everything. But the only thing that ever mattered was the truth. If you ever meet her, Lena, tell her this. She is not just the heir to a name. She is the heir to the silence I carried. Let her turn it into something louder, something honest, and tell her thank you. I blinked hard. The words blurred. Marie touched my hand. He loved you in his way. Distant, tangled, but fiercely. He saw in you what he was too afraid to be. We stood there in silence, the sun catching the glass sculpture behind us, breaking into 100 refracted lines. What will you do now? She asked. I don't know, I said truthfully. But I think I'll start by telling the story he never did. She nodded, then walked away. I didn't follow. I stayed in that courtyard for hours, sketching the shapes of the shadows, letting the light tell me what to do next. That night, back at the gallery, I made a decision. I would launch a new exhibition. Not of my work, but of his. Not the businessman. Not the empire. The photographer. The hidden artist. The man who saw truth but never showed it. I called it Charles Unseen. And I would tell the world what he'd tried so hard to keep quiet. Not for revenge. Not for redemption. But because truth once seen cannot be unseen. The press release went out on a Monday morning. Simple. Unadorned. Charles Unseen, a private lens on a public man. Opening night, Beacon Hill Gallery, April 14th. Curated by Lena Crawford. Within hours it caught fire. Every major news outlet wanted the story. Headlines screamed with disbelief that the mogul who built half of Boston had lived a secret second life as an anonymous artist. They wanted previews, exclusives, interviews with me, the granddaughter who had become both gatekeeper and curator of his hidden legacy. I declined most of them. This wasn't about spectacle. This was about witnessing. I spent the next 2 weeks combing through the vault of negatives, sketches, and contact sheets that had remained untouched beneath the gallery for decades. Rolls of black and white film carefully stored in metal canisters. Journals detailing camera settings, weather notes, even the exact kind of paper he used for each print. He had documented everything. Working-class neighborhoods in Boston before the developers came. Fishermen on the coast of Gloucester. Buskers in New York. A woman with tired eyes holding a baby outside a closed grocery store. His images weren't grand. They were honest. Raw and human and quiet in a way most photographers are too proud to capture. And none of them had ever been shown. Until now. Opening night arrived with cold rain and a line of umbrellas curling around the block. Inside, the gallery glowed. Every wall had been redone to fit the aesthetic of the man behind the lens. Charcoal gray paint, soft matte lighting, handwritten captions below each print, scanned from his journals. The first photo that greeted guests was one of his earliest. A child looking through a cracked window, fingers splayed on the glass. I had seen that exact image once, in one of his private books. He had captioned it simply, "Watching the world, waiting to be invited in," had always made me ache. But tonight it felt like an arrival. The gallery filled fast. Critics, curators, former executives, art historians. Even 3 former CEOs showed up, tie knots tight, eyes sharp with the need to be seen caring about the late Charles Whitmore's art. But none of them mattered. Not really. 'Cause then she walked in. Nadine. Followed by Gillian, Uncle Greg, and a few others who had once tried to wrest control from me with polished smiles and polished knives. They moved through the gallery like strangers in a museum built on their denial. Gillian stopped in front of a portrait of a sanitation worker eating lunch on a curb, squinting at the label beneath it. "He took these?" she asked no one in particular. I didn't answer. Uncle Greg shook his head. He never said a word. "Maybe because he knew you wouldn't understand," I said quietly behind him. He turned, startled to see me. "Lena, this is who he was," I said. "Not the man in your balance sheets. Not the man in your press releases. This." I gestured around the room. "He spent a lifetime hiding it. And now he's finally being seen." Greg looked at the image again but said nothing. I let the silence linger, then walked away. Toward the end of the night, as the crowd thinned, Heather approached me by the back wall, where a series of never-before-seen family portraits were displayed. One showed my mother, young, laughing, barefoot in the garden. Another showed me, age 6, asleep on his lap at the summer house. "I don't remember him like this," she said, her voice fragile. "Neither did I admitted. "But it feels true." I nodded. "It is." We stood there for a long moment. Then she turned to me. "You did something tonight," she said. "Not just for him. For all of us. For yourself." I met her gaze. I needed to. As the last guests filed out, the gallery dimmed to its after-hours hush. Michael arrived just as I was locking the front door. He had been covering a story in Chicago and only landed an hour ago. But he was here. And that mattered. He stepped inside and walked straight to the photograph of Charles's self-portrait. Shot in a mirror, camera blocking half his face, a single tear visible on the cheek that remained. Michael studied it in silence. Then said, "You've turned grief into something sacred." I reached for his hand. "I turned truth into a wall," I said. "Finally." He smiled, kissed my forehead and whispered, "Your grandfather would be proud." I nodded. But inside I knew something deeper. He already was. Later that night, I stood alone in the middle of the gallery. The rain still tapped on the windows. And for the first time since the will reading, I felt the weight in my chest ease. Not disappear, but settle, like it had finally found its place. 2 weeks after the exhibition opened, I received a package that didn't come through the front door. No courier, no postmark, no return address. I found it one morning resting inside the gallery's mail slot. Slim, rectangular, wrapped in plain brown paper with only my name printed in delicate ink. I opened it carefully. Inside was a leather-bound portfolio. My grandfather's handwriting was on the first page. "For your eyes only." My fingers trembled as I turned the pages. Inside were letters. Not business documents. Not asset reports. Letters. One to me again. Others. To people I didn't know. Names I recognized from his stories. Some from business. Some from his youth. Some possibly regrets. I read the one meant for me last. "Lena, if you're reading this, then the work has already begun. Not just the gallery. Not the company. You are the work. I left you wealth, yes. But wealth is a shallow gift. I left you silence. That I know was cruel. But necessary. I needed to know that you could fill the void with something other than noise. And you did. You didn't run from it. You built something from it. Something I never could. The gallery was always yours. Even when you didn't know it. And the family. They will never love you the way you hoped. But they will fear disappointing you. And sometimes that's enough. Protect what matters. Destroy what doesn't. Love boldly and photograph everything. With gratitude and awe. I closed the portfolio slowly. And cried. Not out of pain. Not out of confusion. But from the kind of peace that only arrives when the map finally matches the road. Months passed. Spring turned to summer. The gallery continued to grow. More visitors, more exhibitions, more artists who had once been overlooked and now found a platform. The foundation expanded to support creative education in underserved schools. Students sent in their first photos. Some shaky. Some brilliant. Oh, brave. I spoke at a few events, reluctantly at first. Then more confidently. I wasn't the shadow anymore. I wasn't the silence. I had become the voice. As for Whitmore Industries, I never ran it the way they wanted. I didn't sit in the leather chairs or sign contracts in gold ink. I hired better people. I restructured the board. I enforced ethics where profit once ruled. And the company survived, even thrived, not because of me, but because of the values I demanded it uphold. Family was trickier. Uncle Greg resigned from the board 6 months after our confrontation. Jillian moved to Europe and started an art advisory business, ironically now requesting exhibitions from the same gallery she once scoffed at. Heather and we grew closer, slowly, awkwardly, but real. We met once a month. Sometimes over wine. Sometimes in silence. Sometimes just to walk through the city with no agenda. Trust like film develops in the dark. On the first anniversary of my grandfather's passing, I stood in the gallery alone. The place was quiet. The lights dimmed. The city outside buzzed with the beginnings of autumn. I hung one final photograph. One that had never been displayed before. It was taken the day of the will reading. Self-portrait. Me. Sitting in the back of the law office lobby. Clutching the $25 check in one hand. The envelope in the other. My face caught between devastation and defiance. I had set the camera up without thinking. But when I found the file months later, I knew it had to be shared. Because that was the moment the story really began. Below the photo I typed the caption myself. The price of being underestimated. I turned off the lights. Stepped into the night. And felt at last like I had inherited not just a fortune, but a future. My own. On my terms. And no one else's.